All right, if we can get everyone's attention, we're gonna get started with our Friday evening program. We appreciate everyone sharing a very rainy Friday night in March in Michigan with us tonight. And this is one of our many series of Friday nights in March that we are here, so we would love to share all of our Friday nights with you. So please feel free to come back. Next week we start looking at some of the history of our surrounding communities like Troy and seeing how they intersect with the history of our own community here. So thank you very much for coming out. Another thing just to mention, on Sunday is Founders Day. Founders Day in Rochester commemorates when the John Hersey, or the James Graham family arrived on March 17th, 1817. And so the Rochester Historical Commission does host a program. It's on Sunday here at 2 o'clock. It's on the history of leader dogs for the blind in our community. We do just ask you to register ahead of time so we can make sure we have enough chairs set up, and we really appreciate that. And even for programs like this is a very popular program. So we realized anything with the Great Lakes, anything with Detroit seemed to be the two most popular programs. But we do ask for people to register ahead of time as much as possible. And if you're a member of the museum, of course, all these programs are free for you, and we appreciate that. Membership is what helps put roofs on buildings and digitizes archives and all that. So consider being a member of the museum. We would love to have you here. And then Debbie Reamer is here, and we have two programs, and there are flyers on the table back here. One of them is we do walking tours of the Clinton-Kalamazoo Canal. And the Clinton-Kalamazoo Canal was the first public works project in the state of Michigan when we became a state in 1837. It was an effort to dig a canal that would connect Mount Clemens, Michigan with roughly Saugatuck, digging a canal connecting the Clinton and the Kalamazoo rivers. Sounded like it was going to work just great. Everybody had come around the Erie Canal, and they got from Mount Clemens to Rochester when it went bankrupt. So, but we talk about that and the evidence and what it took, and it's an amazing story, and the evidence is still amongst us. So we do a walking tour that's on April 20th. And then the Packard Proving Ground, we like supporting other museums around us. The Packard Proving Ground is celebrating on June 6th, which is D-Day. They're celebrating a D-Day program from 9 to 4 on the grounds of the Packard Proving Grounds, which is on Van Dyke, just south of 24 Mile Road. Correct, Debbie? 23. It's been there all along. In fact, the buildings are designed by Albert Kahn, and we have an exhibit right now in Albert Kahn. So with that, we would love to find excuses for you to come back and visit us frequently. So let's get into our program today. Tonight we're welcoming Bruce Kopytek, who was born in Hamtramck, Michigan, into an inquisitive working class family who valued faith, education, and culture above everything else. As a youth, he traveled widely with his family and still does today with his wife, Carol. They reside in Rochester Hills, Michigan, and he is employed as a licensed architect with 42 years of experience. His designs include various commercial and residential projects locally, nationally, and abroad. Currently, he is responsible for the master plan of Northville City Center, a project that will preserve and enhance the 1954 shopping center built by the J.L. Hudson Company. Bruce previously wrote 4 titles for the History Press, and in 2020 he launched his own publishing venture, Editions BK LLC. A music enthusiast, book collector, history buff, and avid ballroom dancer, his website, The Department Store Museum, has been enjoyed by over 1 million people. When not home, he is most likely poking around some very old and beautiful place in Europe. At home, he is often found to be laughing at the antics of his 2 crazy cats named Gigi and Mimi. Let's welcome Bruce Kopytek. Welcome.
I'd like to thank everybody for coming out on a lousy night to listen, to hear a little bit about Hudson's. And, it's always a pleasure to see this many people and to talk. I don't know if I'm getting a lot of feedback. Better? Okay, I'll just hold this in my hand, hopefully. So, how many people here, everybody is from the Detroit area, or anybody not? I know that we got one person. So, how many people worked at Hudson's that are here? Okay, we got a couple. And Hudson's was a part of everybody's life at one point in time. That if you bought something, my family, like he mentioned, was a working class family. So Hudson's was a little bit above my mother's pocketbook, but it didn't mean that she didn't like to go there and shop. And we lived on the east side, so we took the Gratiot bus downtown. And we had Eastland also as a favorite place to go. And if you wanted something special, that's indeed where we would go, because they had everything. And if you couldn't find it somewhere else, you could always get it at Hudson's. If they didn't carry it at Hudson's, it pretty much didn't exist. Now, during not this recession, I have a couple corrections to make. I've been working as an architect for 45 years, and it was Northland that we were talking about. Unfortunately, in November, I lost that job, and so I'm no longer involved, and I've given up on architecture because I'm 65. And today somebody said it best. They said, 65, you should be able to do what you want to do. So what I really want to do is study history and write books, and write travel books and a whole bunch of other stuff that's going to come down the line. But you know, it was a part of my life. And the last recession, in 2008, I lost the job that I had, and that I had for a long time, nice company, everything, and I had to do all kind of menial work. I spent 2 years working in a bus parts warehouse, and the day I said I can't do this was the day that I lifted 8,000 pounds of school bus seat foam and put it from the semi onto the ground into a warehouse. It was like crazy. But one of the things the pastor of our church said, the rectory needs some things. The parochial school needed whiteboards and short throw projectors, so I did that work then. But when I had to paint the basement of the rectory, which used to be the social hall, but is now the money counting room, there was a piano against the wall. When I pulled the piano away, there was a brass sticker or a brass plaque on the back of the piano that said, "From the piano salon of the J.L. Hudson Company." So you could get a piano, you could get that little gasket that goes at the bottom of your blender that you have to have so you can keep it all tight and it won't squirt out and leak. You could also get an $8,000 Dior gown. So it was just an amazing place, the likes of which we don't know anymore. Nobody knows. If you had the experience, even at one of their large stores, a branch store downtown, it's a special thing in your heart. I've got personal stories. I know some of you do as well. And the reason why I decided to write this book, it was always interesting to me. I always just adored the idea of a place that brought people together and did all, had all these things. They had great restaurants and always something going on, right, to draw people. They were great merchants that knew how to draw people. But when they were going to start building the building on the site where Hudson's was, I was asked by a friend of mine, said the developer of that building, the Bedrock agency or company needs somebody to give a video talk that they're going to play at the groundbreaking. And he said, I don't like talking in public. Why don't you do it? And I said, sure. So I made the appointment. I went down. There was a young lady that was probably in her 20s, I think, that was doing the video camera. And she had the questions. And she said, so tell me what Hudson's was like. And I went on. I waxed lyrical about all this stuff that I could think of, what it was like. And at the end of it, she said, you know what? I didn't understand a single word you said. Right? And the reason she gave me was that I shop in big box stores. I shop online. If I go somewhere like Rochester or Northville, I shop in a specialty shop. But you're trying to tell me that people actually went 14 floors up to buy things? And I said, and 2 floors down. It wasn't, and the building Hudson's was the tallest department store in the world because of its tower that was 27 stories high. It had 4 basements underground. 2 of them were used for retail, but the other 2 had shipping department. So, they had all this stuff, and it was just amazing. There was a moment in the late 40s when Hudson's in Detroit surpassed the volume of Macy's in New York, which was the world's largest department store. And the Hudson's and the Weber family were just crazy about that they could do that. Now, Detroit was only the 5th largest city in the world in the United States at that time. But we could take a big New York retailer and kind of show them the business. So there was general rejoicing in the executive offices on the 11th floor that day. So it's a great topic, and I hope that this entertains you and bring back memories. I will have my book for sale afterwards, a shameless plug, I'm sorry, but it was a 5 years labor of love for me, and wound up being 548 pages and 7 pounds. So the day that I got my first shipment, I was standing out on a day like today in front of a storage unit, and there were 2.5 tons of books that had to be lifted up and moved into the storage unit to get them out of the weather. Luckily, I have a son that would help and did help, so we got that done pretty quickly. But it's a long story, but it's a labor of love. And I started writing, and I couldn't stop because all the stories, all the interest was so great. So I'm going to share that with you tonight. If you remember, the J.L. Hudson Company had this big presence. Their logo was known all over town, mostly. They had several over the years, but that was one that was quite famous. Woodward Avenue was the center of everything downtown, and it was this big, monstrous building. Now, I'm going to get into a little of the history, but I always thought this building looked like a very, very brutal, huge medieval castle made out of red brick. And indeed, that actually was one of the ideas in the architecture of the building because of the Hudson family's history. So this was a family-owned business. It's not Amazon where there's some guy you hear about that's going to the moon and all this stuff, and he's on a big ego trip. This was a family that really owned this store. They were really here in Detroit, and they really had great ideas, and they were really very civic-minded people, all the way from the founder. But we have to talk about the history of Detroit a little bit, because I couldn't tell you about Hudson's unless we had a setting for it, right? And so you have a diamond in the rough. It doesn't look great. It's not until it's polished and set where it can be useful as a piece of jewelry that you really appreciate the diamond, right? And my wife, who loves her jewelry, will tell you all about that. But I'm not a great one to talk about that. But that's how I see the whole idea of telling the history of Hudson's. This is Detroit in the late 1800s. The city hall is right in the middle there, and I think here is a good thing because I can use this. I can't use it on the screen. Our waterfront and all this traffic, freight traffic, passenger traffic on the Detroit River. An early railroad station, the Michigan Central Station, was there. You see Woodward Avenue, Grand Circus Park, industry off on the horizon, the big factories, automobiles, all that. But we started off as a French settlement, and the city had very definitely had French overtones. The first church in Detroit was St. Anne du Détroit. It was a French parish, and that was where the French settlers from the year, oops, sorry. Getting ahead of myself. The French settlers came in 1701. So it's a fairly old city, and eventually it got into British hands. So then the whole religious landscape changed because now you had Catholics and Protestants. And then you had the Revolutionary War. The original name of Detroit that the British gave it, it was Fort Pontchartrain du Détroit, and Détroit in French means the strait. The Detroit River is a misnomer. It's not a river. It's a strait between two bodies of land. And the British knew it as Fort Shelby. If any of you remember, there still is a Fort Shelby Hotel, and it's more or less on the site of the original Fort Shelby downtown, or close to it. And it became a great trading center because of its location. There's a point where the Lake St. Clair spills into the strait that's formed, and the river flows east and west with Detroit north of Canada at that point. And so it was strategic. It was a great place to protect because all the shipping on that river had to go through that little stretch that we know as the Detroit River. And, there became an industrial center. We used to produce stoves, railroad cars, rails, iron rails for railroads, and we know that the railroad built the West. And we were in a location where people were coming from Europe, getting into port in Boston, New York, Baltimore, whatever, and then heading west. And so a lot of people stopped along the way and made Detroit their home. Even people who settled in Canada eventually saw the industry in Detroit and came this way. So that opened it up to be a place of great business. The plan of Detroit is very interesting. In 1805, the whole city that had gone through the Revolutionary War and all that burned down. There was a fire, kind of like the Chicago fire of 1871, but not a single person died because it was a city of wood. It was smaller than Chicago was in 1871. This was 1805, but it had to be rebuilt. And one of the characters, if anybody's familiar with the Belle Isle area, there's a park right beside the Belle Isle Bridge called Gabriel Richard Park. Gabriel Richard, it was Father Gabriel Richard, he was a Catholic priest. He was the first person that, because he was a leader of the French community at least, he decided in 1805, the minute the fire started, he had started thinking about how are we going to help people after it's done. And it literally burned the whole city down, but he got the bucket brigade going, and he got people together to get things out of their house before they burned so that they would have food right after, and had people go off on horses and connect with people that could come and bring things and help the citizens of Detroit. So he became very, very well-liked, well-known. In fact, the Protestant British Episcopal mostly population of Detroit, they did not have a minister. The church in England never sent a minister to them in Detroit. So they begged Father Gabriel Richard to hold their services, which he did for them. So a very interesting kind of foundation of people. But the US government, after the fire was done, they sent Judge Augustus Woodward to Detroit, and that's where we get the Woodward Avenue, and he was going to rebuild the city. He was in charge of that. So he commissioned a plan. I'm sure he didn't do it himself, but it was a plan that was commissioned that was going to make Detroit a city more of hexagons and triangles. And so you have vestiges of it left in downtown. There's Michigan Avenue. This is essentially, this is Monroe here, but this is Gratiot going off, Grand River going this way. This is Lafayette Square, Cadillac Square, I'm sorry. And Cadillac was the one who stepped off the French boat and founded Detroit. And then there would be Grand Circus Park. And this whole thing could be modular and could grow in these modulars. Well, property speculations, most of the property was sold off in strip farms that started at the river so you could get your goods to the river and went all the way back into the woods where it wasn't even that safe because of the Native Americans that were kind of hostile at that point. I can never understand why they named a city after Pontiac or named a car after him. Or I noticed that they changed the Chief Pontiac Credit Union to Chief Credit Union because he was a brutal murderer, basically. And so it's a little bit strange to me in that respect. But this plan didn't last. They superimposed a grid on it. So that's why downtown is the traffic mess that it generally is today. But when I talked about Detroit being a French settlement, Detroit in the 1920s and before the Great Depression was referred to as the Paris of North America. Has anybody heard that? And it's mainly because of these boulevards, but also because it had a French founding culture. And these boulevards were lined with monumental buildings, like the boulevards of Paris. And there were monuments also within there that were like the monuments of Paris in a way. So that's why, and a French culture, obviously. There was a certain joie de vivre with the French culture. Now, I have a problem with that because I read a book about Paris and about Emperor Napoleon III and his right-hand man, who was Haussmann, Baron Haussmann, who Paris was a dirty, sewer-infested, tight medieval city with streets that went like this and just get lost, crime. If anybody's ever seen Tale of Two Cities, it's portrayed pretty well in that. It's an old movie, but it's great. And Haussmann didn't do his work until the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. So we had the Grand Boulevards like 45 years before that. So I would submit Detroit isn't the Paris of North America, but I think Paris is the Detroit of Europe, right? Don't you think? I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. So I think they should push themselves as that going forward. Now, so that area developed, and you can see that there's a little bit more of a grid imposed upon this, but this map is right from my book, and it's kind of a directory of what was downtown in the 1950s and 1960s. When I was a boy in the 1960s, infant in the late 50s, and you had Hudson's right at the center there, and there was Crowley's here, and Kearns was there, and Woodward Avenue had stores and shops up and down, office buildings. There was more in downtown Detroit in its heyday than any shopping mall could ever have, because you could go to the biggest post office, government, you could go to court if you had to, you could eat, you could stay in beautiful hotels like the Book Cadillac or the Statler that was up on Grand Circus Park, and there was just a lot going on during that heyday. Hudson's really had a lot to do with it because they were originally on Campus Martius. I'll tell you about the development of that, but many other cities, if you look at, they have a main shopping street and they have a department store at one end and a department store at the other, and people from those cities will say, you'd start down here, you'd walk down, go all the shops, and then you'd end at that one. So, and it's kind of like a mall, and malls are like that. They have the anchor store at either end. Well, Detroit was all clustered. It was because of this plan. But Hudson's, you can see how much bigger than Crowley's. Hudson's was 10 times bigger than Kearns, and Kearns went out of business in 1959. Obviously, it was not easy living next to, it's kind of like Ukraine versus Russia. You're living next to the bear, right, in that case. But even Crowley's was a good, about a third of the size of Hudson's, but it was hard to compete, really, in that way. So it just became that big institution right out of history. It was founded by Joseph L. Hudson. He was a native. He was born of England. He was born in Newcastle upon Tyne in northern England. Here he is as a young man, young businessman in Detroit, kind of snappy dresser. Obviously sold men's clothes, which was his main business. But his was a rags to riches development. His father was a coffee merchant in Newcastle, was not as successful. He married into a society family, and in those days, there was a big, you just didn't do that in England in those days. If you like Downton Abbey, you kind of get a feel for that. He decided to come to North America to see if he could make a fortune. Was not successful. He worked emigrated, settled in Hamilton, but the young boy, J.L. Hudson, was just maybe 10 or 11 years old, and he had to go to work. One of the quotes from J.L. Hudson was that when he got his first job, he made $5 for a month, pushing a cart up. Anybody ever been to Hamilton, Ontario? So there's this thing called the Niagara Escarpment that forms Niagara Falls, and Hamilton has what's called the mountain, and that's the edge of the Niagara Escarpment. As you even approach it from the expressway, you're on this mountain, you can see the city below. He used to have to push carts of groceries up that mountain as a 10 or 11-year-old boy. But he was really proud of himself because he said his parents told him, his mother in particular said, now that you're working, you get butter on your bread. None of the other siblings did because they weren't working. And so he felt that was one step in his manhood and adulthood because he got butter on his bread. And so it was a rags to riches kind of story, and he had a very lowly kind of existence. His father didn't work out for him in Hamilton. He moved to Milwaukee. That didn't work out. Left the family in Grand Rapids. They wound up in Ionia, where Joseph was old enough to go into business with his father, and their store was a success, except for the fact that in 1873 there was a terrible recession, and they lost everything in that recession. He was not able to pay. His father was older at the time and getting closer to death. His mother had passed away. She had, I think, 9 kids. She was worn out from everything, and she didn't live that long. The store failed in Ionia, and he had to pay he could only afford to pay his creditors 60 cents on the dollar. So they took a 40-cent loss. That idea never left J.L. Hudson, that he cheated people out of 40% of what he owed them. And it bothered him. We'll talk about that as we go on a little bit. But eventually, after that failure, he moved to Pontiac, Michigan, where he met this fellow, who was Mabley. And Mabley's was the biggest department store in Detroit at one time, before the age of Crowley's, Hudson's, and Christopher Mabley was his first name. And he recognized that J.L. Hudson had a very good mind as a merchant. So he put him in charge of this big department store. And unfortunately, Mabley's wife was meddlesome. He was a drunk. And the building that this Mabley's department store is about the only building downtown that housed a department store that still exists. And it's the headquarters of Bedrock on Woodward Avenue. If anybody knows, there used to be there's a Grand Trunk pub on the east side of Woodward, a little further down, but this building's right next to it. And it's been beautifully restored, actually, as Bedrock's headquarters, but that's where the store was. And the big First Federal Bank building that's next door, that was the site of first the Russell House Hotel, and later the older Pontchartrain Hotel. But the Russell House was right next door, and Christopher had a door between the Russell House bar and his office. And he spent more time in the bar, I think, than he did, and his wife would come, my mother did that one time. My dad, I remember her packing us up in the car at dinner time because my dad didn't come home. And next thing you know, we're on Van Dyke, and she's pulling my dad out of a bar by his ear. Just hilarious. But anyway, the wife started fighting with Joseph L. Hudson. The store was very profitable because J.L. Hudson kind of was putting his ideas to use and going over Mabley's head. Well, that caused problems. They decided to take a very long grand tour of Europe in the late 1800s. And when they came back, Mabley said, "Where's my store? Everything has changed around. The merchandise mix was changed. Things were moved around. There were sales, this and that." And when they came back, it was like maybe 3 months later, and J.L. Hudson showed him the balance sheet, how much money that they had made once he enacted his policies. So Mabley went back to the bar, and the wife got into another fight with J.L. Hudson, and he decided he was done. So he wound up opening a store in what was at the time the Detroit Opera House. And on the ground floor of that building, there was retail space, and there was a department store, which was the oldest department store in Detroit at the time, called Newcomb Endicott Company. I don't believe there's anybody in this room that's old enough to remember, because it went out of business in 1927. But they had this space on the ground floor. So when they vacated that, because they built a new building on Woodward, J.L. Hudson decided to start his business there. And it was he had a band playing in there for the grand opening, but he wound up taking some of Mabley's very best salespeople with him. When he left, they went with him rather than stay at Mabley's. And Mabley eventually passed away. Somebody took over, the store went out of business. So they made a good move when they went with J.L. Hudson. Even Mabley's own brother went with J.L. Hudson. So it tells you, I think that alone tells you something. So this was in 1881 when that opened. And from then on, when that was outgrown in 1887, they moved across Woodward to the building, if anybody remembers Sanders downtown on Woodward. So that building housed Hudson's, and I think in 1963 it burned down, and they took the top floors off. And Sanders was only like 2 or 3 floors or something like that, the basement and whatever. But that house, that was the original building that housed Hudson's in 1887. And the success just piled one after the other. It started off as basically a men's and boys clothing operation. At one time, J.L. Hudson had stores in Buffalo, Cleveland, Sandusky, St. Louis, St. Paul, Louisville, Cincinnati, and all that, because he was successful with that at the time. And he would have his brothers in some cases, or these trusted salespeople, or Mabley's brother went, I think, to run the store in Toledo that they had there for many years until it burned. And then these salesmen would open those stores for him, and so they were like the branch office, but then they reported to J.L. Hudson. There he is again, like a little bit more middle-aged as a successful businessman. And he was off and running, really. And an interesting story from that time, he was a very, very remarkable man. The first move he did from then Woodward Avenue was to Farmer Street, and people said, and this is a story you hear a lot, why are you going to Farmer Street? Woodward's where the action is. And he said, well, I got this property, and he built what was called the big store. It was a big red store. They're kind of small, but it has turrets on the corners, and it's made out of red brick and sandstone. And the turrets remind me a little bit of a castle, a little bit. So I get that idea of this thing being a big medieval castle. And he even had to expand that store on Farmer Street because he was so successful. But he was an entrepreneur. He was not just an entrepreneur, he was a philanthropist in Detroit. He became the wealthiest man in Michigan at the time, and it's said about him, I don't know how true it is, but that anybody that ever approached him for help got some sort of help from him, one way or another. And I have one story, which is true. It was talked about when he passed away. It was in part of a eulogy, that there was a gentleman in Detroit at the time that had committed manslaughter. Something that he did, they don't go into detail, something that he did had caused someone to die. So he was sentenced, he went to jail for 10 or 12 years or something like that, because it was just a manslaughter charge. It wasn't a malicious murder of somebody. And when he got out, he wanted to get back into business. But as you know, once you have a jail record, people aren't that interested. I turned 65, and nobody's interested in a 65-year-old architect anymore. And the harder I tried, the more upset I got, until I said, I'm done. But this guy was not that, not that old. He wasn't, superannuated. He decided to go to J.L. Hudson. And he said, look, this is what happened. I paid my debt to society. What society asked me to do as punishment, I did it without complaint. I was a model prisoner, but I have an idea for a business, but I can't get any traction with it. And J.L. Hudson told him, I agree with you. Your idea is great, and I agree with everything you said about yourself, but what you really need is promotion. You need somebody to get behind you. And he said, yeah, how am I going to do this? He said, well, you know what? I know the editor of the Detroit Free Press. Come for a walk with me. So they left the Hudson's building, walked down the Detroit streets to the headquarters of the Free Press, and he went to meet the editor. And they worked out a plan where the editor was going to promote this guy's business, talk to some investors that might be able to help him, and he eventually went on, apparently, to be successful. When J.L. Hudson walked back to the store, maybe the next day, the editor of the Free Press called him up and said, "Hey, Joe, why did you feel like you had to walk all the way over here? You and I are really close. You could have just called. You could have sent a messenger or something, and I would have seen the guy if I knew it was coming through you. You didn't have to take all the time from your busy schedule." And he said, "No, yes, I did, because I wanted to walk down the street with that man so everybody in town would see me walking with him, and they would know that he's okay as long as if he's walking with me, he's okay, because he's a friend of mine." And so that was like his approach to people and things, which I think is really pretty wonderful in terms of that. So he donated the land and built the first YMCA building in Detroit that was torn down not too long ago. He also donated the property for the State Fair at 8 Mile and Woodward. He bought that, and he sold it to the city for $1 so that the city could have it, and then the state would operate the state fair out of that for many, many years. So really, he was a great, not just a success business story, but a good person. He never married. He was engaged toward the end of his life, and he had a whole bunch of brothers and sisters, and one of his sisters married William Clay, who was connected to the Ford family. So the Fords and the Hudsons were actually part of one bigger family because there was intermarriage between the Fords and the Hudsons. So Ford was a big stockholder in the J.L. Hudson Company at one point. But he even, speaking of automobiles, from early, like 1907 through to the 50s, eventually became part of American Motors, but there was a Hudson Motor Car Company. Now, J.L. Hudson didn't run it, he didn't own it, but he put up the money for it, and he was an honorary chairman of the board, and they were known as really hot cars. And they were economical, they were the top NASCAR racing cars of their day. And this is interesting because this is the J.L. Hudson coat of arms. On that, what's that? Castle, right? That's representing Newcastle, where they came from, where their family came from. And then the ship is an image of, everybody knows the Hudson River, right? So Henry Hudson, or Hendrick Hudson, was the explorer that was trying to find the Northwest Passage and went up the Hudson River. And that was his ship that was called the New Moon. So those two things, referring to their name, I don't believe they were related in any way, but because of the Hudson name, they put the New Moon on their crest. This is the badge that would be on the grill of any Hudson motor car. Castles and the New Moon, Henry Hudson's New Moon. So it shows the connection between the two companies there, in a way. And this is Joseph L. Hudson at an older age. After the turn of the century, he started to slow down. Became kind of portly, actually, after a while. We all do, right? At least I do. And you can see that he's getting older, right? And but he had no heirs. He wasn't married. His sisters and brothers were similar age, if not older than him. But he had one of his sisters stayed in Ionia and married a guy by the name of Weber there, and they had 4 sons. And one by one, he invited these sons over to come and work at Hudson's under his tutelage, and he trained them how to be merchants. And they were the people. Joseph L. Hudson founded the company, made it a success to start with, but the 4 Weber brothers were the ones that really built it into that giant monstrosity on Woodward Avenue. So it's also a very fortunate thing and a great understanding, because family succession in a private business is a terrible, terrible. So usually the son takes the business from the father and then it runs it into the ground, and that's it. You know, it's a rare thing where a family really sticks together like that. And he couldn't do it with his own kids, but he had these nephews that came to appreciate what he taught them and all that. And Joseph L. Hudson decided that before he was sick, before he got too sick, he wanted to go back to England and see his hometown. And so he set off on a trip on an ocean liner, one of the very fast German Kaiser Wilhelm II, or whatever it was called, 4-stack, like the Titanic, and went over to England. But he took his private doctor with him because he was already not feeling well. And the doctor had said, well, you need to get out in the fresh air. The sea air will do you good. You need to travel and get away from all the stress of business. Well, before he left, they expanded. I don't know if I show that. I don't show that here. But before he left, he had an addition put on the store, bought a narrow piece of property. And in architecture terms, we call them bays. So it's where you have a window and there's columns, but in between is called the bay. So it's just 2 narrow bays on Woodward Avenue. And he built a 10-story building with 2 basements or 4 basements, 2 usable ones and 4th one. And that was their first foot back onto Woodward Avenue. And that building formed the nucleus of that giant store at one point because they continued, after he died, they continued to buy pieces of property on Woodward. Now, he took this trip, landed in England, and died a few days later. He was sick on the ship going already. But before he left, he did 2 things. He said, in this new building that I built, I'm going to put a hospital on the 10th floor because I want my employees to get the medical care that they need. So they can always come to the doctors there and get, they couldn't have surgery, but they could at least get some help, on medical things at the time. And he bought an estate on the Detroit River in Windsor that was for young women in the organization because in those days, a woman didn't go on vacation alone, right? A woman wouldn't go across country on a train and stay in a hotel and go out to eat and things like that by herself. But they could, if they were a Hudson employee, for a very minimum charge, go over to this estate in Windsor that was right on the river, and there were tennis courts and hiking trails and all this stuff that women could feel comfortable. It's all women there anyway. They could feel comfortable and not, it wasn't a pickup joint, let's just put it that way. They could actually have a nice vacation, mostly on his dime, because it was, they were not paid terribly highly, but they could afford what it took to get across there and use that. And those things eventually, the hospital stayed to the very end of Hudson's, but that facility closed after a while, maybe during the Depression or something in Windsor. So the 4 Weber brothers were Richard, James, Joseph, and Oscar. And that is the age progression. Joseph and James were twins. And in the company, they were not known as Joseph and James. They were the merchandising geniuses of Hudson's. Richard was the businessman. Oscar was the operations man, and these 2 were the merchants, the merchandisers that decided what merchandise to be bought, how it was going to be sold, how were they going to sell things, et cetera, et cetera. And the 2 twins were, they put these 2 buttons way too close together, right? How did I skip that far? The 2 twins were known as Tom and Jerry throughout their lives in the store. So, because they were always together. They were both doing the merchandising job, and that was their nickname. So, they lived until the late 60s, early 70s, so they had to figure out a succession plan of their own. This was the era that big stores started to expand every year more and more, every couple of years something more. And also when they initiated new things like the bargain basement, Hudson's Budget Store. That was one of the twins, I believe, or Oscar's idea, that we need to serve the lower echelon of the market too. We can't just serve the higher end there. And they had new ideas. But in 1925, up to this time, they had filled out the whole Woodward Avenue frontage. And there were years between 1910 and 1923 that this building looked like it was missing teeth. But every time they could get another piece of property, they built an identical piece in between. So it was a very, very big store, and it's still connected to the building on Farmer Street. But in 1925, they decided to tear down the Farmer Street building and start building what was called, at the time, the Greater Hudson Store. And these were completely new 15-story buildings, but this is the Farmer Street one here that was built in 1925, and it's got this really odd extension on the end of it there that might make you wonder, why did they do that? What is it about? Though there's a story there. This was the biggest department store in Detroit. The oldest one was Newcomb Endicott and Company. So they had buildings on Woodward Avenue, and this is Grand River, and this is Farmer Street. In 1927, the J.L. Hudson Company, after putting this part of the building up, bought Newcomb Endicott and shut them down, tore down their buildings. This building right here had only been built, I think, in 14, so it wasn't even 10 years old when they tore it, or 13 years old maybe when they tore it down. But nobody was going to stop them from taking the whole block, basically, at that point. It was so big. And on Woodward, here was the original older buildings that were built piece by piece. The Farmer Street building was there. That little part of that tower was part of this big Hudson tower. If anybody remembers, like I do, heading toward downtown, and if it was dark, you'd see the red Hudson sign on all three sides of that tower lit up in red. And you knew you were in Detroit because that was a landmark there. So in 1946, eventually part of that greater Hudson store was the Grand River Avenue building that was built where Newcomb Endicott's was. But in 1946, there had always been a little corner here, Salon Jewelers, that would not sell to the Hudsons. But in 1946, they did. After the war, they even expanded further. They built an end, like a bookend to that building that matched the newer 1928 and 1925 buildings, and added more floors even for stock rooms and equipment and everything. 2,136,000 square feet of space. That space is kind of like one of our bigger shopping malls, all put in one on many floors. And from the street, Woodward Avenue was just bustling with people going downtown on the on the buses. I have the picture on the cover of my book is a little different because there's two buses parking. Here's some cabs, but it just dwarfed everything downtown. And again, you could find anything there. So there was an issue with the move a little bit issue with the succession of the company as these Weber brothers got older. Through the 40s, 50s, they were the golden boys. They just built that company up into anything. Well, James Weber's son, who was named appropriately James Weber Jr., was the heir apparent. And he was as respected a businessman in Detroit as J.L. Hudson himself was. He founded the Torch Drive. He sat on the boards of hospitals and many, many different things like that. So he was quite a man. This is the opening of Northland Shopping Center in 1954, which is a story in and of itself that I was intimately involved in, well after it had closed. And this is his son turning the golden key in a door at Northland to open the first large regionally planned shopping center in the United States that was a Hudson brainchild. Unfortunately, James B. Weber in 1956 went up north to Alpena on a hunting trip to his cabin, had a heart attack and died. So the company was left without a leader. So tragic. He was a well-respected, well-liked person. But as I said, J.L. Hudson had these brothers that went to other cities with his branch stores. And most of those branch stores closed by around the turn of the century, because there was another recession in 1893 and they couldn't keep the branch. A couple of them stayed open, one in Buffalo, but it was eventually swallowed by AM&A's, another department store in Buffalo. And Joseph Hudson's brother, I can't remember his name, William, it's right there. William lived in Buffalo, stayed in Buffalo, operated the store, it stayed open. When it was merged into this other department store, it was known as J.L. Hudson Clothier, the men's division of Adam Mellerman Anderson Company. So he was an executive with this big department store in Buffalo, and he had a son, and that son had a young man that was served time in the military in the Korean War era, and he actually wrote to his uncles, the Webers, and said, do you think that I could come to Detroit with my wife? We just got married, but I'd like to see if there's a job for me at the store there. And they said, fine, if you want to work on the loading dock, you can come, and we'll see what happens. Well, what actually happened was that they, he came in 1956, and by 1961, he was president of the company. I have a very good friend that lives in Florida. I went to grade school with him. His wife was the daughter of the one-time director of personnel for Hudson. So they sent me pictures of her father being roasted by J.L. Hudson Jr. for his retirement. And he could sit in the Santa Claus throne that they had. They brought it down where they had the employment party luncheon and all that kind of thing. But I have a quote in the paper of Don Brown, who's my friend's father-in-law, was my friend's father-in-law, and he said in the paper, in the Detroit Free Press, do you know that Hudson's was so lucky to get this guy? They didn't know what they got when he came to work on the dock, because he rapidly rose, because he was smart, he was able, he was likable. Carol and I have a good friend in Milwaukee that worked at Hudson's when she was younger and said, when Joseph L. Hudson Jr. came in the accounting department where I worked, or the adjustments department or something like that, guess what? I would swoon. He was so good looking. Everybody was like coming around the corners of their desk cubicles and everything to see Joseph L. Hudson because he came by. And throughout the company, I don't know if there's anybody that worked there that can confirm this, that everybody thought he was a really nice guy, that he was he was also a civic leader. He cared about Detroit and took a lot of things into his hands, especially after the riots in 1967. Funny story, a fellow contacted me and said, I've got a story. He said, well, I worked in the accounting department, and I was working later one night, and I got in the elevator to go down, and that all the elevators in Hudson's, right? And seeing the glass elevator through the glass doors and everything was quite a kinetic experience. But they stopped at the executive floor. He worked on the 14th floor maybe or something like that, and the executive floor was 11, and J.L. Hudson gets in. And he said, I'm in the elevator with the CEO. But he said, J.L. Hudson turned to him and said, oh, you're working late, aren't you? And he says, yeah, I get more work done, so I stay a little bit later some days. And he said, well, that's good. He said, answer me a question. He said, do you actually like working here? And he said, yes, as a matter of fact, I do. It's a friendly place to work, a nice place. The facilities are great, good food in the cafeteria. And J.L. Hudson Jr. told him, you know what? He said, I'm so glad that you were opened up and told me that, because I'd hate to think that I'm running a company where people didn't like working there. So personable enough, I have a hard enough time with bosses that I've had to get them out of their office to talk to me. And so I could figure out better what they want. And here was a man that walked the floor every day and made friends out of people, or at least acquaintances, that worked for him. So he had a very great reputation. His wife is still, he died in 2021, in his 90s. His wife is still with us, and she helped me a little bit with some things with the book and all that, so it's kind of cool. They lived in Grosse Pointe. So he guided the store through those 60s years. And in 1969, the business in Detroit fell down. They had been building branch stores all over, and it was getting kind of hard to maintain the company, whereas big chain groups were building up because they had more combined power than an independent department store. So an offer came from Minneapolis, and the Hudsons knew the Daytons from Minneapolis. So an offer came, hey, we'd like to merge. We'd like to buy you out and merge. We'll keep both stores the same, but we want to see if we can't work better together. So J.L. Hudson actually had to convince members of the Ford family and members of his own family that this was probably a good idea, that if they didn't do it, they could maybe lose the business eventually, or see it that just kind of, for lack of investment capital, start to dwindle away. So that was really his big thing. Unfortunately, one of the things, they really wanted to close the downtown store at that point. Minneapolis had a great, very active downtown, and Dayton's in downtown Minneapolis was like a star store of the country throughout the 60s and 70s, whereas Detroit just kind of declined. So that had to be taken care of, and he was not willing to close the downtown store. So he retired in 1980, and they had a president came from the Dayton organization, which at the time wanted to become a national retailer. They wanted to be like Sears or maybe even Saks Fifth Avenue, that had stores all over the country. So they bought up some other department store chains. But in the late 50s, they founded Target. And Target was a cash cow for them. Target made more money than the department store because they had lower prices, more traffic. So that became how they wanted to become a national organization. And you know what the Dayton Hudson Corporation's last name was? Still is, as a matter of fact, Target Corporation. They eventually threw the family names out because Target was their big business. So they achieved that, becoming a national retailer, but not with department stores, as we knew them. So they did a study right after J.L. Hudson retired and decided that the store had to go. So it closed at the end, downtown closed at the end of 1982 after the Christmas season. And it sat vacant for all those years, and then unfortunately it was imploded. Sad story, I feel. Here's Joseph L. Hudson Jr. with the manager at the opening of, they had freestanding budget stores at one time. There was one in Madison Heights, one in Dearborn, Pontiac, et cetera. And the company just became very powerful. as a retailer up until that very late end of the 1960s, early 70s. And the Dayton Hudson company, when they took it over, they really turned it into a cash cow too. It was one of the most profitable department stores. They eliminated a lot of lines. You couldn't get quite as many things at Hudson's as you used to be able to, but they really, became a fashion retailer that was respected and still had the nice restaurants and all that. But the downtown building, if those of you who have been there and remembered it, was an incredible experience. There's just nothing like it. Even Macy's in New York, it can't hold a candle, I don't think, to what we had here. And obviously, this is the Farmer Street side. There's the library there, and that tower that was part of that big building. It had an elevator in it that a semi-trailer could be taken up in the elevator to drop merchandise off at any floor where that. So if they were a shipment of men's clothes was coming from the warehouse, the elevator would take the trailer of the truck. They back it. It doesn't show very well in this little sketch, but right here, there was a place where the alley that came through the store, people remember, if you were down there, there was an alley that you had to cross to get from one building to another. So that was the Farmer Street building was there, but if you were shopping for handbags and cosmetics over here, you could cross that alley and get into the other side where they had the pantry shop and hosiery and stationery and a variety of things like that. And it was such an experience to cross that alley because it could be nice and warm in the store, but it was cold because there was wind was blowing through this thing, and it was dingy and dark, and there were trucks, and it smelled with diesel fuel, and the sound of the trucks boom, 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 in there and everything. So it's just an unusual experience, one that I don't think an architect would build into a building today. But it was just a natural reflection of the organic growth of that building. It was kind of something cool that people remember. But the number of elevators in a row on either side of that building, you could stand down a corridor and see elevators, and they had white globe lights saying if the elevators were going up and down. Elevator operators in blue uniforms, gray in the summertime, that knew the floors. It was 10th floor pots and pans, 3rd floor linens and children or whatever. So everything about it was an experience, really. I mean, incredible. And I hope these are the things people remember. But there's 51 passenger elevators. The big freight elevator that took trucks up was here. And so there were also, on the inside, there were not only the passenger elevators, but there were freight elevators, 28 of them, 5 different stairwells through the building, 2,600 windows, 550 fitting rooms throughout the store. They had 3 floors of women's clothing for different budgets, ages, etc. There's nothing like it. And of course, the main floor was always bustling with people. And the famous part of that, you can see here, some of it was high, some of it was low ceiling, because it had what was called a mezzanine at the time. And I always lament that you don't get a good mezzanine anywhere anymore. But the mezzanine had a restaurant, it had stationery, coins and stamps, and Detroit's biggest and just about most profitable bookstore anywhere. You could go and just browse. For a while, I worked downtown in the early 80s, and I would still go on my lunch hour and browse books. I'm a bookaholic. My wife will, to her chagrin, Carol doesn't, we're out of bookshelves at this point, and I've got to come up with some plan to get more bookshelves. So, but the store just had all these, everything was in counters. And so you had customer service people that would help. One fellow that was a manager downtown, he was telling me, I had this salesperson in cosmetics. She was my top salesperson. But when, she knew all her customers, and somebody would come in, and the lady would come in, and she's going, hi there. She's, wow, you're looking down. He says, come on, I'll fix you up with some, new makeup and whatever. She didn't care. She knew it wouldn't insult the person because she was trying to help him and all that. And then he also, Mrs. Hudson would come in, the wife of Joseph L. Hudson Jr., and she could call up to, one day they had a rep from one of the cosmetics companies was coming in, and you could come in and they would do some makeup for you. But Mrs. Hudson asked, I've got a wedding this weekend. Could they possibly take me up to Joe's office and give me a complete workover or whatever? And they did, so because she had privilege, right, as the wife of and she was a socialite. She really was in. J.L. Hudson was an art enthusiast, so J.L. Hudson Company had a bona fide art gallery. They had art gallery shows on the 7th floor for much of its existence, and things like that, you just don't see it. some parts of it were a little more modern looking, and it had been renovated a number of times. One of its last renovations was in 1967, and it got this look with the chandeliers and fluted columns and things. But this is an older picture, always walnut wood, marble, travertine marble floors are very distinctive. And it would, like I said, remodel from time to time. And the 50s, they redid one of the fashion floors with all new departments and named the departments different things. At one time, you went to this shop or that shop. It was like a shopping center inside that you'd go to. If you were a boy, they had a young man. If you wanted jeans and stuff like that, you went to the thread mill. That was the shop in there that sold that kind of thing. And on the 7th floor, of course, was the Woodward shops, which was probably one of the huge fashion centers of all of America. And when they redid the Woodward shops in 1961, they flew in, they called it the fashion airlift, that they flew in all these designers to show their clothes in the Woodward shops and things like that. You can bet my mother never bought anything from the Woodward shops, I can tell you that. And of course, everything I've been talking about, in 1959, Life magazine, which you probably all remember, and I think they still have some kind of thing, I just saw it in the grocery store, it was like a one issue kind of special thing. But this was a cutaway they showed of how big Hudson's was and what a grand, amazing store it was. And you can see the 2 basements here and the escalators connecting the basements and then all that service area down below. The main floor, and you can see the mezzanine, but it didn't take the whole floor, so there was that high and low kind of concept as you circulated through the store. But if you look at this closely, and it's in the book, that you can see what's going on the floor. So floor 7, well, I'm going to I can show it anyway. So obviously there was that Hudson Tower that had the equipment for the elevator. They had an auditorium. If you ever went at Christmas time, you go to the auditorium, and they had shows. They had all this stuff going on in the auditorium. 7th floor with the Woodward shops there, and they actually you can see models modeling clothes in this drawing, and ladies sitting on settees that they're showing clothes to them. Salespeople in that kind of department would bring something out to show somebody and say, "Was this what you're looking at?" And she'd start like fluffing the skirt of it and that to show how it moved, and it was just a really personalized type of experience. Women's fashions, men's store on the 2nd floor, the mezzanine, that grand 1st floor with all the glittering jewelry and cosmetics and leather goods and all that kind of thing. Yeah, scarves, everything. So it's just an amazing thing, I think, that, like I said, that girl would not believe, right, in these days. And, at one point they took it to the suburbs too, because they developed Northland Center, and was intimately involved in this building, understand the history of it. The Austrian architect that fled, because he was Jewish, fled World War II, came, he had what was known as a designer of stores. He was eventually known as the grandfather or the father of the shopping center. And then he disowned what he created because he didn't like that it was all surrounded with parking lots, and the shopping centers became isolated, and that wasn't what he sought to do at Northland. He wanted to create a modern European town center for people to walk through and see stores and enjoy the fountains and plantings and things like that. But he convinced the J.L. Hudson Company that that's what they needed. Richard Weber did not want to expand. He said, Hudson's is Hudson's downtown, that's all it is. But Detroit expanded. And so, and they did not want to just put a store in a strip mall or anything like that. They were not Federals, they were the J.L. Hudson Company. So Victor Gruen, who was the architect, he had an office designing stores and shopping, or just not shopping centers yet, just storefronts and things like that in New York, and he had one in Los Angeles. He made out pretty well in America. And he was flying in 1948 from Los Angeles to New York to his office, and there was a huge storm along the East Coast. The plane landed in Detroit and couldn't take off for a day. So he called up some people he knew, and he took a tour of Detroit, and he said, Detroit is kind of run down. He did not like Detroit, but he said, that J.L. Hudson Company, wow, that's a landmark. It glitters at night, it's amazing. And his friends warned him that you do not approach, the J.L. Hudson Company is like a dynasty. You don't go right to the king, you gotta find an ambassador and get yourself an appointment. So he actually did talk to the James B. Weber Jr., who passed away in 1956, 2 years after Northland opened. And he said, I like your ideas, but we have to sell my father and my uncles on it. And he said, next time you happen to be in Detroit, stop in again. If you want to bring some stuff with you, show your ideas, I can get you in with the brothers. And So mysteriously, the next week he showed up in Detroit. Again, next time he's there, he made a next time because he thought they were his ideal client. So he designed Northland, Eastland, Westland, and Southland for the J.L. Hudson Company. They're pioneer shopping centers, really. Eastland, which was a refinement. I'm an East Sider, so I'm very particular to Eastland, very nice. Unfortunately, it's been torn down for warehouses. Was a people place? Now it's a no-go zone. So Westland was the first enclosed of the malls. Even then they've expanded. Oakland Mall, Grand Rapids, all over the state of Michigan, really, by the 70s. The longest chapter in my book that I became very fascinated with were the events that Hudson's had. I said they were merchants. They knew how to draw people to themselves. And if you came to the store for something, you're going to buy, right? Because you're going to see this stuff. It's inevitable. And they were very right. But one of the first of the big events that Hudson's had, in 1923, they commissioned this giant flag. And every Flag Day, it was unfurled on the store. Boy Scouts would come, bands would play, and it was a big event on Flag Day. It was a celebration. That flag was replaced in the 40s with an even bigger one because it had deteriorated. And then by 1959, when Alaska and Hawaii came on, they had to wait for President Eisenhower to sign a decree on how the new 50-star flag would look before they could put the new stars on it. But the stars on that flag were 8 feet high. So I'm 5'10". You can get an idea how big it is, right? So during World War II, they were one of the biggest sellers of war bonds. But they actually had a big event in the auditorium with Victor Mature and I can't remember who the other, I don't know if it was Joan Crawford or somebody was performing in a theater in Detroit, a legitimate theater, and they came and, was that Joan Crawford? I'm not sure, I can't read, that's too small, but there was another actress along with Victor. There was actually a lot of celebrities that came. So there was that. In 1947, after the war, they commissioned a series of artists, each to travel around the state of Michigan and paint 10 paintings, and it was a show that was exhibited in the auditorium called Michigan on Canvas. And I got a copy of the exhibit catalog off of eBay, and some of these pictures are beautiful. And after the thing was shown, it was distributed all over the state of Michigan. And I had a lady contact me and say, is there a way we could try to get that all together again? I don't even know if some of these pictures exist anymore. There's some at Cranbrook, I think. I looked up and saw a couple there, but it was 100 paintings in total that were part of this. And they wanted people to see the state of Michigan through an artist's eyes and promote Michigan that way. And it was a big success. People flocked downtown to see the show. In their 75th anniversary year, they had the Detroit of 1881 in the auditorium. They built dioramas and all that, but also the Detroit of tomorrow. After that show was ended, they had a new one that filled in. That was the Detroit of tomorrow, which showed what expressways would be built and Cobo Hall and all these things as part of the new Detroit. They had flower shows every year from the 60s right up until, I think, 1968. I can recall going to the Japanese flower show with my mom and sister, and we watched an origami demonstration. I'd never seen anything like that. So it was educational for people as well. In this one, you can see all these people crowding that floor, just looking up at the huge amount of flowers and plants that they brought into the exhibit. And one year it was just a flower fantasy, but then they had a Mexican themed show and then a Hawaiian themed show, and they got the airlines involved, so they raffled trips and things like that. So everybody remembers the fireworks, right? That was J.L. Hudson. The first one was in 1959. It was when the International Freedom Festival was started, and that was Hudson's gift to that festival. One of the most popular things they did in the 1960s was called Good Old Summertime. And they had, I don't remember, I think there were 70, maybe more, display windows on the ground floor. Everybody remembers the beautiful windows displays that they had, especially at Christmas time. They opened up those windows, so each window all around the store would have like a candy shop or a photography studio, all with an 1890s theme. And so they had Keystone Cops walking on the sidewalk cafe, sing-alongs, all kinds. And the first one, I think, was in 1961. It was so popular, it was going to last for a week, and they had to extend it another week because people couldn't get enough. So that lasted for a long time. And celebrity visits. Anybody who was anybody, if you were an author, if you were a celebrity, you came to Hudson's. Now, Gloria Swanson was just off of Sunset Boulevard, and she had a line of dresses that she promoted under the Gloria Swanson name. And so she would come and do fashion shows. So she'd model the clothing herself and narrate what it was about. Joan Crawford made several, she's a favorite, but she made several visits. She had a line of hats, and she wrote books. So she came to the bookshop, did a book signing. Everybody remember the Galloping Gourmet? He made appearances at Hudson's and cooked in front of people in their test kitchen. And here's the even later one with Kirk Douglas, was in a movie called Posse. I don't remember it, but he came to promote that at Hudson's. So really the events were incredible. The restaurants were well memorized. I'm going to try to wrap this up. I could talk for hours about the fabulous food that they served in their restaurants that wasn't too expensive, but they were very elegant. Downtown, they had several on the 13th floor. They had a mezzanine dining room. There was fourth floor, had a snack bar. The basement had a cafeteria. All over the store, you could, depending on what your budget was, you could eat. And some of the specialties that they serve, I had a friend of mine just sent me a picture today. Hey, we're at this restaurant in Northville, and look, they have a Maurice Salad. Well, no, a lot of restaurants have Maurice Salad because that's a part of our tradition. I can tell you, though, that the story that everybody believes about the Maurice Salad is not true. Everybody thinks it's a Detroit specialty, right? They said that, oh yeah, there was the received wisdom is that there was a chef at Hudson's called Maurice, and he concocted the salad. And that's how it became known as the Maurice Salad. Well, Detroiters are going to be very unhappy when I have been revealing this for some time, that it actually came from Pittsburgh by way of Cleveland to Detroit. And Maurice was a Jewish band director. His mother was a Ukrainian opera star. They emigrated, again, because of like my own grandparents, because of worldwide troubles at the time. And he was a talented musician because he came from a musical family. So he was in Cleveland, moved to Pittsburgh, where he became the band leader at Pittsburgh's very famous William Penn Hotel. So he would go in before, to rehearse with his band before the evening, because every evening was dining and dancing at the hotel. Another thing that I lament that isn't around. But and he wanted to eat a salad. So he came up with telling the waiter, he probably got a free meal before rehearsals. He said, I want a salad, and I want chicken in it, and I want this, and I want that, and I want that. And so every day he would come in and order his salad, and it got to be known as a Maurice Salad because his name was Maurice Spitalny. And they put it on the menu even. To this day, it's on the menu at the William Penn Hotel in their restaurant. But it's very different from the one we know. Maurice was Jewish. He didn't eat ham. So in Pittsburgh, they swear by the Maurice Salad, and it had red pepper relish on it, that's their salad, and that's how they have it. The Holland & House Hotel in Cleveland, the owners, the chef, knew the people in Pittsburgh, so they brought it to Cleveland, but they added ham and something else, and they got rid of the red pepper relish, which is something you can pretty much only get in Pittsburgh. And then eventually, I have no idea when it came to Detroit. The earliest advertisement I've seen for it in Detroit is in the early 60s, 1961 or something like that they talk. And I've seen bunches of ancient menus from the 30s, 40s, 50s from Hudson's that they have at the Detroit Historical Society, no Maurice Salad. So it kind of worked its way over here. It's not a Detroit, it became a Detroit specialty, but not even more than it would be a Cleveland specialty or a Pittsburgh specialty. So that's the lowdown and the real truth. They started serving cocktails in 1969. 1958, the year of my birth, they combined several of the restaurants and created the Riverview Room. These were the older restaurants, had very traditional decor. Only of these three, only this one, the Pine Room, survived it was an event space, but then it became something called the Beef Baron in the 70s that served beef lunches, beef sandwiches, au jus, or that kind of thing. But the Riverview Room, that's the mezzanine dining room. People, even before I wrote the book, were saying, I remember that place. You could sit at the rail and just watch all the people on the ground floor shopping and all that. But the Riverview Room was interesting. It had murals done by a Birmingham artist that showed the Detroit riverfront, maybe in the future with all these ships. And then you sat at a rail as if you were on a ship, right? With that. And then it had great big windows that were opened up to see the Detroit River from that 13th floor restaurant. And it stayed that way to the very end. They were famous for their bakery. pantry shop, menu items. I talked about the Maurice Salad, but their chicken pie. And that, again, at Christmas time, they were very famous for plum pudding. So those are all English things. It was not a chicken pot pie with vegetables in it. It was a chicken pie like an English pork pie, or it just had chicken and chicken gravy in it with the pastry all the way around. So it was their, a little bit of a different thing. When they merged with Marshall Fielding Company in Chicago, their chicken pot pie was famous, but it was like what we would expect with peas and carrots and good things like that in there. And of course, Christmas time, or the employees, this is my friend Lynn's father, Don Brown, being roasted. You see he's sitting in Santa's throne there, and he's got some sort of sign around his neck, and J.L. Hudson Jr. is actually appreciating him, for the service that he gave to Hudson's before he retired. And they kept him on, actually. He retired, but he would fly up here during the week and do work for Hudson's, and then fly back down to Savannah, Georgia, where he retired for the weekends. And then they had a flat for him in one of the towers, like across from Belle Isle. So Larry and Lynn and I used to get to go there when he wasn't there. It was fun. Madeline Coe was their fashion maven for many, many years. She knew every designer. When she walked in those places, they knew her by name because she was famous. And she would write columns in the Detroit News of what women would be wearing. She attended a fashion show for Yves Saint Laurent in the 60s, 70s, when the look was going to be lumberjack, kind of outdoorsy, chunky boots for women. And she sat with Zsa Zsa Gabor at the table and reported in the Free Press that Zsa Zsa Gabor, when they're watching these women walk down the runway, and she turned around and said, "What woman would want to look like that?" So, I mean, it's just, you could just imagine the whole scenario there. Obviously, elevator operators, the majority of which were African American that ran those elevators. They had to be trained. They made more money than the salespeople, actually. The salespeople were jealous of their jobs, and they had to know where everything was. If anybody asked them, like, where am I going to find a pin cushion? Oh, third floor, fashion fabric department. The notions are in the back in the Farmer Building. That they could. And they were also, it was understood by most women that if they would tell their children when they go shopping, if you get lost, if you get separated from me, you go to an elevator operator and she'll take care of you. And they would get somebody over that would take the kid and put the announcement on the PA that little Ronnie's looking for his mother, or whatever like that. They would take care of him. So they served as ambassadors really to the store. This is a friend of mine whose mother had a heart attack while working at Hudson's. And they called the people down. She slumped over at her desk in the 1960s maybe, or 50s I bet it was. And people from the hospital came down to her. They called an ambulance that came up that elevator, picked her up, went to the hospital. She got better, worked for another 25 years for Hudson's. And J.L. Hudson came to her retirement. J.L. Hudson Jr. came to her retirement party, which she said was like the apple of her eye. That was just a great thing for her. There's a picture of the hospital. There was somebody being treated by a nurse during the day. It was for customers and for employees. And at one time, they had, I think, 4 doctors and like a team of 16 to 20 nurses, because if you called in sick and you needed help, they would send a nurse to your house from the hospital there. So and that was when Detroit wasn't, it didn't take an hour to get from one end to the other. But somebody whose parent, that's a lady that talked to me, her mother, stories are in the book, but her parents met at Hudson's, and that they were a Hudson's family then. And a lot of people tell me that working at Hudson's, and I don't know if the ones that say they did, they said it felt like a family, more so than a store, because you knew the people you were working with and all that. So, I contact with a lady today that she saved some of the Hudson's Christmas displays, and they live downriver in, I think, Taylor it was. And every Christmas she works with the city of Taylor to put that in their recreation center, and you can tour it, and all the funds go to a food bank for poor people. And she told me, she says, I worked in the offices on the 14th floor, and I was involved in the stores. I worked with the architects and all that, but before I started, I was a girl out of high school, and I went to work there. And she said, I was so starstruck at the time. And my first job, they said, Vincent Price is coming to the store, but he's going to come up here first and meet with Mr. Hudson. So why don't you go by the elevator and wait for him to come out and then just escort him back here to the offices. And So, okay, and she said, Vincent Price steps out of the elevator in a cashmere coat, 3-piece suit, hat, scarf. She said, in my life, I thought I was gonna die right there. And she said, I just about fainted. And she said, I never ever, to this day, I've never seen, that's her husband, but she said, to this day, I never saw a man as elegant, as charming, and as wonderful as Vincent Price was when he stepped off that elevator. So, interesting things. That doesn't happen to somebody every day, right? But a big place like Hudson's could make it happen. The Hudsonians were the employees, from different sources. This is a team from Grand Rapids in the 70s. Christmas time, Hudson's did not have the oldest parade in North America, but it predated Macy's parade. The oldest parade in North America was at Eaton's in Canada, but it was originally referred to as the Big Children's Parade, and it was meant to be like a bunch of toys coming down the street, but eventually it turned into this big Christmas Santa parade where Santa arrived and was given the keys to the city on the marquee of the Hudson store. Really, really a fabulous production, very much respected in the world. We have one of our friends, even Lynn, my friend's wife, she didn't go downtown that often. She's even though her father worked there, but he took her down to be in the parade because they needed bumblebees and things like that they could dress up. She was on the Thanksgiving parade as a Native American with the Pilgrims. One friend of ours was a bumblebee, and she said that it was just so cold that I had to wear leotards and it was freezing, but she said what warmed my heart was every time they told us that we had to make eye contact with kids and just dance around the street and make the kids laugh. And she said, but when I'd see these kids would look at you and their face would light up. And she said that made it all worth it. It was warm, so there's a different perspective. We see a parade on TV or something like that, but a totally different perspective and the employees were encouraged to be a part of that. I think they got hot cocoa afterwards for it. They weren't paid, but being that the Hudson family was very faithful, and J.L. Hudson himself was an extremely religious man. They always had a nativity window, at least one, in their store to remember what Christmas was about. It wasn't just about presents and shopping, but also one year they did the whole nativity story in the windows there, and that was and you could see the artistry of the display people there were incredible. Before I lost my job, I found a 500-foot-long mural in Northland that was, I think people I brought to see it, art restorers, and it said it was a hugely significant find. And they wanted to see it. I talked with Bedrock about putting it in the new building downtown, but unfortunately, I'm out of that, so I don't know what's going to happen. But they used those display people to do a lot of things. They had these import fairs, and they would build like replicas of the Tower Bridge in London and the Ponte Vecchio in Florence over the counters to give it like a European atmosphere. Christmas Carol was a famous character. My Christmas Carol sits right there because when the holidays come, she says, that carol, she's like this, and says, that holiday, that normal Carol that you're married to, she's going away now, and you're not going to see her for a couple months because Christmas Carol's in her place. And that's true. I have Christmas Carol at Christmas. Maureen Bailey was her name. She was a student at Shrine High School on Woodward, and she asked her teacher, she had an idea for a character that would help Santa, and she wanted to go down and promote it to the J.L. Hudson Company, a girl in high school. And the teacher said, well, we'll let you do that, but you have to, if you do it, you're gonna have to maintain at least a B average in your classes. And so she went downtown, talked to their display executive, and he said, I think it's a great idea, and we're gonna do it, right on the spot. And she became Christmas Carol for the first couple seasons. Anybody remember JoJo, Shuddy McGregor she was Christmas Carol for a while in the parade, and they had Christmas carols in the store that led the kids to Santa. So just some things that were uniquely Hudson. I'm sure everybody remembers seeing the giant tree of lights on the facade of the store at Christmas time. They had shops. They had the children's only shop where kids could go in and for a nickel or a quarter buy things for their parents. They also had a men's only shop where if you didn't, man was not really in touch with, he was the 1960s Mad Men type, three martini lunch executive, but really wasn't in touch with his wife. They had beautifully dressed salespeople in the for men only shop that would help them pick out things that their wife would like to have for Christmas. So I think it was a marriage saver for a lot of these executive types downtown. That's it. the finale is really sad. Our downtown that had all those people in it turned into that after a while. Hudson's became, a retailer that was very much focused just on very generic kind of, was still a nice store when it lasted, but all the divisions of the Dayton Hudson Company had the same logo, and they all carried the same merchandise, and they were all headquartered in Minneapolis. So it was not quite the local jewel that it was, and then that happened. The day that happened, I was in St. Petersburg, Russia, and I was shopping in a department store that was built in 1723 and had been beautifully renovated. This was 1998. And when I came home, I was driving from the airport, and I saw something's different. They had knocked Hudson's down. That sign wasn't there with the red lights, and it was such a bulk part of Detroit. Detroit looked empty without it. So, it's just a part of history, and that's why I'm here. I want to remember that, but I think my book is like an epitaph, so people will remember. When I'm gone, that book is going to be in a library somewhere, and people are going to remember it. And those memories, when they come back, I think that's a good thing. So I hope that you've enjoyed what I've tried to impart today. I think I went a little bit over time-wise, but I didn't want to shortchange you, let's put it that way. So thank you very much for your attention and time. Anybody have any questions that you'd like me to answer before I put the mic down? Anything? Okay, I think I covered it all then. So, okay, I appreciate it.